The day my dad tried to take everything from me began with the sound of my own
name echoing through a courtroom that felt colder than any winter morning in
Madison County. I remember how calmly the clerk said it, as if she were announcing the next person in line at a grocery store, and not the woman whose entire life was about to be put on trial. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands flat against the polished wood, the chill sinking into my palms, while my dad stood up on the opposite side of the room and told a judge that I was too immature and too unstable to own anything I'd worked for. He said it so gently that for a split second, if you did not know him the way I did, you might have believed he cared. He said I made impulsive choices, that I could not manage money, that I was vulnerable and easily influenced, and that a responsible parent would step in before things got worse. A responsible parent. Those were his words. A faint murmur drifted across the courtroom, catching on the fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead like they were irritated by the entire scene. He told the court he was requesting full control of my assets, not partial, not limited, full. He listed them with the same tone someone might use going over items on a grocery receipt. My savings, my checking account, my car, my home. My future. He said he would manage them more responsibly until I was stable enough to do so myself. He did not look at me once while he said it. He faced the judge with his shoulders squared, delivering his speech like a man reading off a script he had rehearsed in the back mirror that very morning. His attorney sat beside him, a man named Barnett, leaning back with an expression that said this entire thing was a formality, and the outcome was already in the bag. That little smile on his face was the kind of thing that could make a person's blood pressure spike without a single word spoken. Mom sat in the row behind them. Her back was rigid, her hands folded over a thin clutch she probably chose because it made her look proper. She did not raise her head. She did not look at me. From where I sat, I could only see the stiff line of her jaw and the way her knuckles whitened every time Dad said the word unstable. For a moment, I wondered how I must have looked at them. A woman of 30, sitting there without crying or yelling, without begging or pleading, just quiet. Maybe that bothered them most. I remember taking a breath so deep it burned the back of my throat, and in that breath, I caught myself thinking about all the women listening to this kind of story on their phones, or while cooking dinner, or driving to work. If you are listening right now, I wonder what you are doing at this very moment. Are you sitting on your couch, or cleaning your kitchen, or taking a walk somewhere with your earbuds in? I was sitting in that courtroom the first time. This happened to me, wondering how a parent could say something like that about their own child. You can let me know in the comments what you are doing while you listen, because it still amazes me how life can twist in a single moment. The bailiff moved across the room, handing a folder to Judge Raymond Kellerman, a tall man with silver hair and a gaze sharp enough to peel paint. He adjusted his glasses and flipped open the file as if this were any other petition on a regular Tuesday morning. The courtroom was packed with the quiet sounds of people shifting in their seats, clearing their throats, breathing too loudly. Or maybe it just felt that way because every noise was amplified by my heartbeat. I did not look at Dad. I looked straight ahead. If I turned even slightly, I was afraid I might see what I used to look for when I was a child, some hint of warmth in my parents' faces. But that kind of hope ages poorly. It becomes brittle. It breaks easily. Dad kept speaking. He told the judge that while he admired my academic achievements and respected my choice of career, he feared I lacked the judgment to keep myself safe. He said my spending habits were questionable. He claimed I isolated myself from family guidance. He even mentioned my home in Knoxville, calling it modest but poorly managed, as if he had ever stepped foot in it. He had not. I sat there thinking about all the nights I worked overtime to save up for, the down payment, the months I lived off peanut butter sandwiches just to afford enough furniture to make the place feel like a home. I thought about the secondhand car I bought with cash, and how proud I was to finally have something that ran without coughing smoke every morning. Every item Dad listed was something I had earned with sweat and patience. Hearing them reduced to bullet points in a courtroom made my stomach twist. Barnett leaned in and whispered to Dad at one point, and they shared a quiet nod, like two men discussing the final step in a plan. My chest felt tight, but my face remained still. I had promised myself I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. Judge Kellerman closed the folder for a moment and looked directly at Dad. I felt the air shift in the room. Something in his expression changed, the way a storm cloud changes color right before it cracks open. Then he looked at me. Not with pity, not with doubt, just a long, steady look that felt like he was reading something on my skin. He opened the folder again. The room felt heavier, like all the oxygen had been drawn into that thin stack of documents. My hands stayed flat on the table, but my fingertips trembled before I could force them still. I was aware of everything. The way the overhead lights flickered, the scuff marks on the floor, the faint smell of old carpet and cold air, the little tapping noise Barnett made with his pen while he waited for a victory he thought was seconds away. Dad stood straighter as Judge Kellerman began to read. He looked ready to receive praise for being such a concerned parent, ready to be congratulated for stepping in before his unstable daughter wrecked her life. And maybe that is what shook me the most. He believed this was right. He believed this was justified. He believed I was property slipping out of his hands. I swallowed hard, feeling something crack quietly inside my chest, a realization that felt too sharp to ignore. This was not a concern. This was not love. This was not even fear. What Dad was doing in that courtroom was a takeover, a seizure, a quiet, calculated attempt to claim my life the way someone claims a piece of land. And Mom, sitting behind him, silent and rigid, was a part of it, whether she ever said a word or not. When Judge Kellerman lifted his eyes from the folder again, I knew something was about to shift, but I did not know how deeply that shift would cut. And that is where the real story begins. I learned early that in our house, control often wore the mask of love. And sometimes it took me years to recognize the difference. When Judge Kellerman lifted his eyes at me in that courtroom, something inside me reached back to the beginning, to all the moments that shaped the silence I carried into adulthood. It went all the way back to the Midwest, where the winters were long. The neighbors knew too much about each other, and reputations were treated like family heirlooms that needed constant polishing. I grew up in a modest but carefully curated home just outside Fort Wayne, Indiana. He worked long hours at a regional insurance firm, and Mom volunteered for every church committee she could get her hands on. From the outside, we looked like the kind of American family people used to see on greeting cards. A white front porch, a neatly trimmed lawn, the same wreath Mom hung every December. But inside the house, the air was shaped by a single rhythm, a quiet drumbeat of "Dad knows better." Dad said it when he corrected the way I held a pencil, his hand covering mine a little too tightly. He said it when he edited my homework, crossing out my words without reading them fully. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, my feet not even touching the floor yet, trying to explain why I liked writing stories more than doing math drills. Dad tapped the paper and said, "He knows better, Nora. Stories can wait. Numbers matter." Mom followed with her own refrain. "We just worry." She said it when she adjusted my dress before we left for Sunday service, smoothing imaginary wrinkles and fixing my posture by gently pressing my pate, shoulder blades together. She said it when I asked if I could join the art club instead of the youth choir. "The choir looks better for the community," she told me while pinning back my hair. "We just worry about your future." Everything they did was framed as care, help, guidance. But that kind of help came with strings knotted so tight around my choices that I stopped seeing them after a while. At Lakehurst Elementary, I remember being pulled aside by him in the parking lot after school because I had gotten a B on a science quiz. He crouched down next to me, one hand gripping my backpack strap. "This is not your best," he said evenly. "Your mother and I expect excellence." It was not the grade that upset him. It was what the grade might make people think. Mom was the keeper of appearances. She ironed my clothes every morning and made sure my hair looked brushed into submission before letting me step outside. At church, she kept a hand lightly on my shoulder, guiding me from person to person, like I was part of the presentation. "Smile, Nora. Answer politely. Stand up straight." After service, she would lean down and whisper reminders. "People notice everything, sweetheart. We just want you to shine." Shine. That was the word she used instead of impress. But I learned soon enough they meant the same thing. In middle school, I discovered sketching. It was the first thing that truly felt like mine. I filled notebook after notebook with drawings. Mostly faces, people in hallways, teachers leaning over desks, the back of a friend's head lit by the afternoon sun coming through the bus window. One afternoon, Mom found my sketchbook half open on my bed. She flipped through the pages with a strange tightness around her mouth. "These are nice," she said, "but you spend too much time on them. You should join the debate club. It will look good later." I asked, "Look good?" And she answered without looking at me. "For us, Nora. For you too, of course. But mostly for us." He doubled down when I entered high school. He attended every parent-teacher conference with a notebook in hand. He did not ask my teachers about what I loved learning. He asked how I compared to the other students. He asked about leadership qualities and college potential, and whether my quietness might stand in the way of opportunities. I sat there listening to him talk about me as if I were a business strategy that needed tightening. Whenever I tried to speak, he cut in, politely but firmly. "I know my daughter. She is smart but lacks direction. She needs firm structure. He knows better." The words kept surfacing year after year until they stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like law. There was a turning point around age 15, though I did not recognize it for years. We were sitting around the old oak dining table that had belonged to my grandmother. It was a Friday night, and the house smelled like Mom's baked chicken. He wanted to talk about my course selection for the next semester. I had already filled out my choices with my guidance counselor, including a studio art class I'd been hoping for since freshman orientation. He speared a piece of chicken and said, "You will replace that art course with an honors economics class. It is the smarter path." I told him no, my voice soft but steady. The word hung in the room like smoke. He lowered his fork. Mom went still. "You are not thinking straight," he said. "You need classes that build real skills. Art is not practical. It is indulgent." I felt something in me tighten. I told him the guidance counselor said the class would help me build a portfolio. He shook his head. "She meant well, Nora, but she does not know you like we do. We know your strengths. You need focus. You need discipline." "He knows better," Mom chimed in from across the table. "We just worry about you fitting in, being successful, having good choices later." Their voices layered together until mine could barely squeeze through. I said quietly that I want to take the class. I think it is right for me. His jaw moved once, a small muscle ticking like a clock. "You are too young to know what is right. You will switch the class." I told him again that I wanted the art class. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me as if I had just thrown something across the room. He spoke slowly, with a calmness that made my skin crawl. "You are not listening, Nora. You listen or you fail." I looked at Mom then, hoping for a flicker of support. All she did was fold her napkin with perfect precision, her voice soft and measured. "Your dad is trying to help you. We just worry." That night, something inside me cracked. And though I stayed at the table and nodded and played along, I realized I was not being raised. I was being shaped, molded, trimmed into the version of a daughter that fit neatly into the world they wanted to present. Love was not unconditional in that house. Love was awarded. Love was earned by fitting the mold they carved, the mold that never seemed to match the shape of who I really was. As I moved through high school, the pattern kept repeating. David picked my extracurriculars. Mom edited my clothes. I learned to stay quiet at the dinner table because any opinion that did not mirror theirs became a lecture. I learned to apologize quickly because it prevented long stretches of silent disapproval. I learned to keep my drawings hidden and my real thoughts tucked behind polite smiles. By the time I reached senior year, I could barely separate their voices from mine. I looked like a girl who had everything together, but inside I was worn thin by the constant pressure to be acceptable. There is one dinner memory that still makes my stomach tense when I think of it. We were all seated around the table one Sunday evening. Dad had invited a colleague and his wife, and Mom had spent hours preparing the meal. The talk was light at first, circling around weather and church activities and the newest development in town. Then he mentioned my college applications. He said proudly that I would be pursuing something practical, maybe business or economics. I felt my throat tighten. Earlier that week, I had received a letter from a small arts program I loved. They had offered me a partial scholarship. I had not told my parents yet. I was waiting for the right moment, though now I know there was never going to be one. His colleague turned to me and asked what field I truly wanted to study. His voice was kind, casual, an easy question to answer. I opened my mouth and said the first real thing I had said at that table in a long time. I told him I had been accepted into an art program and was thinking about pursuing it. The whole table went silent. He set his fork down. The tiny click of metal against porcelain echoed like a threat. "Nora," he said calmly, "you are not considering that. You are going to choose a responsible path. We have discussed this." Mom cut in quickly, her smile tight but polite. "She gets carried away sometimes. We just worry she will waste her potential." The colleague looked confused. He asked what I wanted, and I opened my mouth again, but he spoke over me before I made a sound. "She wants stability," he said, his voice final. "She knows that." The conversation moved on without me, but inside something in my chest dropped. That was the night I understood none of this had ever been about guidance. It had never been about love. It had always been about control, wrapped in soft words. I learned to stop trying to speak in that house, because every time I did, my voice was swallowed by theirs. Sitting in that courtroom all these years later, watching him speak with that same calm authority, listening to Mom breathe quietly behind him, the same lesson echoed through me. Nothing had changed. The stage was bigger, the audience was real. But the script was exactly the same. For them, love meant ownership, and the moment I stepped out of the mold they made, I became a problem to fix. The memory of that dinner table settled heavy in my mind, blending with the bright courtroom lights and the cold, polished wood under my hands. It felt like I was standing in two timelines at once, the girl who had swallowed her voice, and the woman now watching her parents try to legally claim everything she had built. And as Judge Kellerman shifted in his seat to speak again, I realized the story of how I got to that courtroom did not begin with the petition. It began at that oak table in Indiana, the night I learned I would never be heard in my own home. That understanding settled into me like sediment at the bottom of a lake, heavy and unmoving, and it stayed with me long after I left Indiana in the summer of 2014. There was no dramatic exit, no shouting match, no slammed doors. I packed my car quietly while Mom watered her garden and Dad read the newspaper at the kitchen table. I told them I had accepted a job offer in Knoxville and would be moving into a small rental while I figured out the rest. They nodded in that polite, distant way they often used when they did not approve but did not want to discuss it in front of the neighbors. Mom hugged me with arms that felt more like obligation than affection, and Dad said that it was good to get experience, but that I should call often for guidance. I drove away while the morning sun reflected off the rearview mirror, and I remember feeling strangely numb, like my emotions were still inside that house and would take a while to catch up. Life in Knoxville did not start with fireworks. It started with long days of learning how to stand on my own without the constant hum of judgment surrounding me. My first apartment was a small one-bedroom with thin walls and a kitchen so narrow I had to turn sideways when I opened the oven. But it was mine. I remember the first night I slept there, lying on a mattress on the floor because my furniture had not arrived yet, listening to the distant hum of a neighbor's television through the wall. I felt an unexpected wave of relief. No one was checking if I made the bed neatly. No one was timing how long I spent drawing in my notebook. I could breathe without worrying how it looked. My job at Cumberland Mutual started that same week. I had been hired as a compliance assistant, which meant long hours reading policy documents and entering audit notes in spreadsheets. It was far from glamorous, but it fit me. I liked finding patterns in the data, noticing the things that did not add up. There was a quiet satisfaction in catching something others overlooked. It felt like the first job where my careful nature was an asset instead of something that needed fixing. The early years were simple but disciplined. I lived on peanut butter sandwiches and cheap pasta for a long time, I tracked every dollar in a little notebook I kept in my kitchen drawer. Rent, utilities, groceries, gas. I wrote it all down. On weekends, I walked around thrift shops to find pots and pans that cost less than $5. I bought my couch secondhand from a neighbor who was moving across town. I learned how to budget like my life depended on it, partly because it did, and partly because saving money became my way of building a spine no one else could bend. In 2016, after 2 years of steady work and quiet living, I found a small townhouse for sale on a quiet street near the edge of Knoxville. It had a faded front door, old carpet in the living room, and a cracked tile in the upstairs bathroom. But the bones were good, and the price was something I could handle if I kept the same tight budget. I remember standing in the empty living room the first time I toured it. Light streamed in from the big front window and hit the wall in a soft golden stripe. I could imagine a life inside those walls. My life. One not measured by my parents' expectations. I put down an offer. I bought the townhouse with a 30-year mortgage. I promised myself I would chip away at it as steadily as I could. And I did. Nights spent packing lunches instead of eating out. Mornings taking the early bus instead of driving. Years of careful tracking, saving every extra cent from bonuses and performance incentives. By 2023, the mortgage was fully paid. It was the proudest day of my adult life. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding the final payment confirmation printout, my knees almost shaking. For the first time, I owned something no one else could claim. Dad called that night, which surprised me because we were never close to spontaneous conversations. His voice was softer than usual. He asked how work was going, how I was feeling, if everything in Knoxville was treating me well. Then he paused, in that heavy way that felt familiar. He asked about my mortgage. Had I refinanced? How much I had left? Whether I had considered diversifying my investments. I thought at the time that it was curiosity, maybe even a rare moment of genuine interest in my life. I did not question it. I even told him how proud I was to be almost done. He said that was good, that it was important for young people to be responsible. And then he shifted to ask about my savings habits. I answered politely, thinking he was finally becoming the dad I had wished for. I was slow to see what those questions truly meant. My work life built its own rhythm. I moved from compliance assistant to audit specialist, then to risk analysis, each step coming after years of proving myself quietly and consistently. My supervisors appreciated that I caught small inconsistencies others missed. I was never the loudest person in the room, but I was thorough. That thoroughness became my shield, something I built for myself when the rest of my defenses had been shaped by someone else's expectations. Outside of work, my life was plain but peaceful. I took long walks around the neighborhood in the evenings. I replanted the small backyard behind my townhouse and turned it into a little garden filled with basil, rosemary, and tomatoes that never quite grew straight. I bought furniture one piece at a time, always saving before spending, creating a place that felt warm and safe. I read on the couch on Saturday mornings and let the sunlight come in through the living room window. I kept a sketch pad on the coffee table, even though I rarely opened it. But just seeing it there reminded me of the girl I used to be, the girl whose voice had been pushed down into silence. Every few months, Dad called. He always opened the same way. How are things? How is work? Are you managing everything well? I often felt, warmth spread through me in those early years. I thought maybe he was trying. Maybe the distance made him see me differently. Maybe we were turning a corner. Then the questions would come. How much are you saving? What is your budget? Are you investing responsibly? What are your long-term plans with the house? Had I considered letting him review my financial documents just to make sure everything was moving in the right direction? He always phrased it like concern. I thought it was just his way. I did not see it as a warning. Mom called with a different energy. Her tone was always bright, too bright, as if she were performing the role of a warm mother while skimming the edges of disapproval. She asked about my health, my church attendance, whether I was making friends, whether I still kept to myself too much. She asked if I was dating, though her questions carried a hint of judgment, no matter the answer. I learned to keep the conversations short and simple. I told her what she wanted to hear without telling her anything that truly mattered. For years, I believed my quiet independence was safe because it was small, ordinary, unthreatening. I liked going unnoticed. I liked the stability I built brick by brick, without needing applause. There was no dramatic success for my parents to brag about, but there was also nothing they could criticize. Or so I thought. Looking back now, I can see the pattern with painful clarity. Dad's calls grew more frequent after 2023, right after the mortgage was paid. His tone softened further. He told me how proud he was that I had built such a solid foundation for myself. He asked more questions about the townhouse, its value, the condition of the roof, how often I serviced the HVAC system, whether I had considered hiring someone to help me manage my finances long term. At the time, I thought he was being helpful, maybe even supportive. A part of me felt warmed by that possibility. I told myself it was better late than never. I had no idea back then that every piece of information I offered so openly was being tucked away, studied, used to build a story he would later present in a courtroom as evidence of my supposed instability. At the time, I only felt relieved that he finally seemed to want to be part of my life. There was one moment that stands out from that period. Something small, but now impossible to forget. It was the fall of 2024. He had called on a Sunday afternoon while I was pulling weeds in the backyard. He asked casually how much of my savings were liquid versus invested. I told him without hesitation, because it felt like a real conversation. When I mentioned a small emergency fund I had built up, he made a soft, approving sound. Then he asked if I felt overwhelmed managing everything alone. I laughed and said no. I enjoyed being independent. He was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Independence can be fragile, Nora. One wrong step, and it disappears." At the time, I assumed he meant life could be unpredictable. I did not hear it for what it was, a glimpse into his belief that my life was something he could steady or destabilize at will. When I think about those years now, what strikes me most is how peaceful they felt, how steady, how unremarkable. I lived my life with a quiet pride, thinking I had carved out something safe for myself, far from the reach of the old expectations that once suffocated me. But life has a way of showing you the cracks in what you thought was solid. And sometimes those cracks begin not with a loud shatter, but with the echo of a familiar voice asking innocent questions that are anything but innocent. Looking back, those small conversations were the earliest tremors of the earthquake that would later shake the foundation of everything I built. I just did not know yet that the ground was already shifting under my feet. The first real tremor came from work, of all places, months before anything with my family began to unravel. It was late spring of 2024 when my supervisor assigned me to assist with an internal audit on a department that handled vendor payments. I had done dozens of reviews before, but something about this one felt off, even from the first stack of documents. Numbers that should have aligned did not. Payment dates repeated in patterns too consistent to be random. A vendor listed as active had no verified address. Small things at first, almost invisible unless you looked very closely. But looking closely was what I had always done best. One evening I stayed late at the office, long after most of the building had emptied out. The fluorescent lights hummed above me while I sifted through digital records and cross-checked entries that refused to make sense. The deeper I looked, the stranger it became. A payment trail that looped back to an employee's personal account. A series of adjustments that should have required supervisor approval, but did not. The kind of thing that could sink a whole team if handled poorly. I sat back in my chair and rubbed my eyes, wondering how long it had been happening. Fraud was a strong word, one you did not use lightly, but it kept circling in my mind like a moth around a lamp. I knew I needed to escalate it carefully, so I prepared a report, checked every number twice, then printed a copy to bring to my supervisor the next morning. When I handed it to him, he stared at it for a long moment and said quietly that I had done the right thing. His tone was heavy, as if I had just opened a door neither of us could close. That audit would later lead to a full investigation and disciplinary actions. But at the time, I only knew I needed to be even more careful in how I conducted every step of the review. I kept my head down, avoided hallway gossip, and focused on the data. It was the kind of environment that demanded caution. I had no idea that while I was bracing myself for a possible storm at work, another one was already forming at home. He called more frequently around that time.
At first, I thought it was because he sensed the stress in my voice. I did not tell him details, of course. I just said things were busy. But he asked if I had considered letting him look over my long-term plans. He talked about financial volatility, mentioned concerns about my stability, and said it would be helpful if someone more experienced stepped in to make
Sure everything stayed on track. I brushed it off gently. I told him I appreciated the offer, but I was managing fine. He paused for a moment and said, "Independence can blind you, Nora. You think you have everything under control until one slip puts everything at risk." His tone was soft, almost fatherly, but the words landed with a chill. I convinced myself I was reading too much into it. Mom called a few days later, her voice bright and careful as always. She said she had been talking with Dad and that they were both concerned I was putting too much pressure on myself. She urged me to let Dad help manage my property, saying it might be too heavy for me to handle alone. "You should not be by yourself with all that responsibility, sweetheart. We just worry." I felt the old familiar weight settle on my chest, the same weight I had felt at the dinner table so many years earlier, when my voice had never been enough to counter theirs. I told her again that I was fine, that I was capable, that things were steady. She made a sound under her breath that could have been sympathy or disapproval. With Mom, it was always hard to tell. Work only grew more complicated as the investigation widened. People whispered in hallways. Meetings were tense. Some employees avoided eye contact with me because they suspected I was the one who had found the inconsistencies. I spent long evenings documenting every step, preparing for questions that might come. One night, I stayed so late that the parking lot was nearly empty when I left. The sky was that deep blue that sits between twilight and full dark, and I sat in my car for a moment with the engine off, letting the quiet settle. My hands were trembling slightly on the steering wheel. I told myself it was just the pressure. I did not realize the pressure was coming from more than one direction. David called again the next morning. His voice was warm, too warm, like honey over something sharp. He asked how my townhouse was holding up, whether I had reviewed the property taxes, whether my insurance policy was still appropriate. Then he shifted to a new angle. He said he had been thinking that perhaps he should step in formally to help manage my assets. He phrased it in a way that sounded generous. He said it would ease my stress and prevent me from making impulsive decisions. I stopped walking in the hallway when he said it. The line went quiet for a moment. Just my breath and his waiting. I felt something in my stomach twist. I asked him why he thought I needed that kind of help. His answer was soft and immediate. "Because you are alone out there, Nora. And because I know better what stability looks like." The words hit me like a brick. Dad knows better. The same old refrain. Dressed up for adulthood, but still shaped by the same belief. He continued speaking, telling me he had always looked out for me, that he only wanted to take some weight off my shoulders. I felt the old instinct to fold, to agree, to keep the peace. But another part of me, the part that had paid off a mortgage and built a career with my own hands, began to stiffen. I told him clearly that I did not want or need anyone managing my assets. My voice stayed calm. There was no heat in it, just certainty. He grew very quiet, then said that he hoped I would not be stubborn, that independence can be blinding, that I was too trusting of myself. I said again that the answer was no. He ended the call with a tone so flat, it felt colder than anger. Mom called that evening. She said she had heard I had turned down his offer. Her voice trembled with something she called concern but felt like scolding. She said I should not carry such heavy responsibilities alone, that it was dangerous to isolate myself, that Dad knew more about these things than I did. "You cannot do everything, Nora. You need guidance. You always have. We just worry about you." I told her gently that I appreciated the concern, but I was fully capable of managing my own life. She paused, then said in a near whisper that she feared I was drifting away from them. Family. I said I was simply living my life. She hung up soon after, her voice tight and small. Something shifted inside me after those calls. For the first time, I saw the pattern not as guidance, but as a silent tug toward ownership. The way Dad spoke about my finances felt almost rehearsed, like he had been building the argument long before I noticed. The way Mom repeated the same lines she had always used felt more like a script
than a conversation. It reminded me of that dinner table in high school, the silence that swallowed everything I tried to say. A few weeks later, he brought it up again, this time in a firmer tone. He said he had been reviewing some long-term strategies and believed he should have access to certain documents. He suggested I give him my financial statements so he could evaluate whether my decisions had been sound. He spoke with the confidence of someone who assumed the answer would be yes. I felt something settle in my chest, a quiet recognition that this was not a concern. This was not love. This was pressure disguised as guidance. And for the first time in my adult life, I met that pressure with a steady refusal. I said no. Not angrily, not emotionally, just no. The silence on the other end of the line felt like winter air seeping under a door. He finally said that I was being unreasonable, that I was misguided, that I was putting myself in danger by trying to handle too much alone. I repeated my answer. No. He exhaled sharply and ended the call without saying goodbye. From that moment, something froze between us. The next time Mom called, she was polite but distant, her questions clipped and careful. He did not call for several weeks. When he finally reached out, his tone was colder, more formal. He asked how work was, and then ended the conversation in less than 2 minutes. I remember hanging up the phone and standing in my kitchen with the evening sun hitting the countertop. A strange feeling washed over me, something sharp and sad. The realization that I was no longer being treated like a daughter, but like an asset that had refused to be managed. It was the first time in my life I felt that they were seeing me not as family, but as something slipping out of their grip. I went to bed that night with a heaviness I could not name, unaware that the fracture between us was not forming. It had already formed. I was only just beginning to feel the break, and I did not realize how quickly that break would widen into something far more dangerous. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in late January of 2025. I had come home from work tired after a long day reviewing documents related to the fraud investigation. The sky was the dull gray of winter, and the air felt sharp when I stepped out of my car. I remember thinking I would make soup for dinner and turn in early. Nothing in my mind hinted at the storm waiting inside my mailbox. I opened the small metal door and saw a thick envelope wedged between advertisements and bills. The return address caught my eye first, Madison County Court. My name printed beneath it in clean, precise lettering. My stomach, a small free fall that made the air around me feel suddenly thin. I stood there for a moment, the envelope cold against my fingertips, before taking it inside. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter, shrugged off my coat, and sat down at the table with the envelope in front of me. I told myself it was a mistake, maybe a jury summons, maybe some clerical error. I ran my thumb under the seal and unfolded the papers inside. The first page hit me so hard that the room felt like it shifted sideways. Emergency petition for conservatorship. Conservatorship, a legal attempt to hand someone else control of my financial life, my property, my decisions, my future. I blinked at the words, reading them again, as if maybe they would rearrange into something more harmless. But they stayed where they were, cutting through my calm like a blade. The filing claimed that I was emotionally unstable, that I was prone to impulsive behavior, that I had made concerning financial choices recently, that I was at risk of harming myself financially and needed immediate intervention. The petitioner was listed plainly. My dad. My breath thinned as I turned the pages. His signature was there, his statement of belief that he was the appropriate guardian of my estate, a line requesting full control of my assets until the court deemed me fit again. Fit. The word felt like a punch in the ribs. Nothing about this was vague. Nothing about this hinted at help or support. It was structured to take everything. My accounts, my home, my car, my autonomy. And it was urgent. Elevating it to an emergency petition meant bypassing long procedures and pushing the court to act quickly. My hands went cold as I kept reading. Every line echoed with something familiar, a polished version of the same message I had heard my whole life. You are not capable. You are not wise enough. You need someone else to guide you. Dad knows better. At some point, I stopped blinking. My eyes burned, but no tears came. I waited for anger or panic or disbelief. But what settled over me instead was a strange, icy calm. Shock first, then something colder, quieter, heavier. A feeling like frost crawling down the inside of my bones. I read the papers a second time, then a third. Each time, the same reality sharpened. My parents had not drifted away from me. They had been studying me, gathering information, waiting for the moment they believed they could justify taking over. I pushed back my chair and stood up because I could not stay still. I walked across the kitchen, then leaned against the counter with both palms pressed to the cool surface. I tried to breathe steadily, but it felt like my lungs had shrunk. I thought back to every question Dad had asked over the past year, every gentle probe about my finances, every moment Mom expressed concern about me being alone. They had not been preparing me. They had been preparing this. After a few minutes, I sat back at the table and read the documents again, this time with the part of my brain that had spent the past decade in audit, work. I saw inconsistencies, overreach, exaggerated claims, statements with no factual base, and beneath it all, a motive so clear it nearly glowed on the page. Property transfer intent. That was what jolted me fully from shock into something steadier. This was not about my well-being. This was about acquisition. I rubbed my temples and exhaled slowly. Whatever this was, I knew I could not navigate it alone. I had been careful, disciplined, and independent for years. But this was not a matter of spreadsheets or good habits. This was a battle someone else had started without warning. I pulled my laptop from the living room shelf and sat on the couch. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I searched for conservatorship attorneys in Knoxville. One name came up repeatedly. Iris Hallbrook, known for handling complex property cases. Direct, sharp, highly recommended. I dialed her office number before I could overthink it. Her assistant answered first and, after hearing my situation, transferred me immediately. Iris came on the line with a voice that carried the calm confidence of someone who had seen every kind of family storm. I explained as clearly as I could. I told her I had just received the petition, that my parents lived in Indiana, that we had no recent conflict that would justify something like this. I told her everything I knew and everything I suspected. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief silence on her end. Then she said that I should come to her office first thing the next morning, with all the documents. Her tone did not sound surprised. If anything, it sounded like she was already bracing for the work ahead. The next morning, I walked into her office holding the petition in a folder, my hands tight around the edges. Iris was younger than I expected, maybe in her early 40s, with steady eyes and a presence that made the room feel anchored. She gestured for me to sit and then opened the folder. She read quickly, but thoroughly. I watched her brow tense in places, her lips pressed together in others. When she finished, she closed the folder with a quiet finality and leaned back in her chair. She told me plainly that the petition was not just overreaching, it was predatory. The claims were vague and unsupported. The reasoning behind the emergency status was weak, and the request for full control of all my assets signaled something beyond concern. She said it looked like a bad faith filing, a strategic attempt to seize control before I had time to react. She asked if I had ever expressed difficulty managing money. I told her no. She asked if I had debt. I told her no. She asked if there had been any incidents that might justify a mental stability concern. I told her no. I even laughed then, not because it was funny, but because hearing the questions out loud made the whole thing sound absurd. Iris nodded slowly and said the petition was built on assumptions presented as fact. Then she pointed to a section near the end. It was a line about ensuring the property did not become vulnerable to mismanagement or liquidation. She tapped her finger on it. Property transfer intent. That is the part that matters most. Someone wanted access to your home, your accounts, your equity. She asked if anyone knew about when I had paid off my mortgage. I told her Dad had known. He had asked. I had told him honestly because at the time it felt good to share something with him. She nodded again, expression tightening just slightly. She said families sometimes mask control as protection, that the petition read less like a parent helping a struggling daughter and more like a calculated move by someone who believed he had a right to my assets. When she said that, the air around me thinned again. Hearing it from someone with authority gave it a weight I could not ignore. I asked her what would happen next. She explained the process, the need to prepare a response, gather documentation,
And secure character statements if necessary.
She said it would not be easy because conservatorship laws were designed to protect people in real danger. But she also said the courts did not look kindly on those who weaponized the process for personal gain. When she looked directly into my eyes and said, "They think you will fold,"
My spine straightened without my permission.
she said it not with pity, but with certainty. They are relying on you to be overwhelmed. They think you will back down. I sat there, absorbing her words,
The truth of them settling like a second heartbeat beneath my own.
It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a misguided attempt to reconnect. It was a siege planned in silence. And as the realization washed over me, the shock that had filled my body the night before hardened into something else, something steadier, something that did not shake. Iris asked if I was ready to fight it. I heard myself answer yes before I fully processed the question. It was the only answer that felt right. When I left her office, the morning felt colder than usual. The sky stretched out in a pale blue that felt too open. I walked to my car with the folder pressed to my side, aware that my world had split into a before and an after. This was not a concern. This was not confusion.
This was war, and war demanded preparation.
In the days that followed, I found myself operating in a state of focus so sharp it felt like my thoughts had edges. Iris guided me through every step. She told me what to gather, what to document, what to ignore, and what to highlight. She said the truth was on my side, but the truth needed structure to be heard. Structure needed evidence. Evidence needed clarity. So I built clarity piece by piece. The first thing I compiled was a full record of my assets. My townhouse on Whispering Trail Drive, purchased in 2016 and paid off in 2023. My savings accounts, my retirement contributions, my modest investment portfolio that I had built slowly. Focus on safer options. Iris nodded each time I brought her another printout. She wanted everything organized, labeled, time-stamped. She said, clarity shows stability. Stability crushes allegations. Next came the income trail. I gathered statements from Cumberland Mutual going back several years. Regular paychecks, annual raises, performance bonuses, all consistent, all traceable, all clean. I had lived carefully for so long that documenting my financial life felt like retracing steps on a familiar road. I spent nights at my kitchen table with paper spread across the surface, making neat piles that began to form a narrative, the story of a woman who had built her life with intention, not recklessness. But the real turning point came when Iris asked if I knew anything about my parents' financial situation. I hesitated. I told her that Dad had refinanced their home several times over the years, though I never knew the details. She asked if I could look up any public records. I did, and what I found made my breath falter. He had refinanced 5 times in the past 12 years. Each refinance increased the loan amount. Their mortgage balance was climbing, not shrinking. Public documents showed dips in his credit score. There were signs of high revolving debt. Iris read the documents slowly, her eyes narrowing. She said the pattern suggested financial pressure. Possibly desperation. Possibly the kind that makes people do reckless things. She asked if he had ever asked me for money. I told her no. Then I remembered something. A phone call from 2 years earlier. He had mentioned the rising cost of maintaining their home. He had said things were getting tight, but he never asked for help. At the time, it felt like a passing comment. Now, it felt like context. Iris added those refinance documents to the growing folder. She said it was not proof of motive, but it painted a picture of someone who might see an opportunity in my stability, someone who might frame a conservatorship as protection, while looking at my assets as relief. She also told me we would need statements about my mental and emotional stability. I felt a flash of something like embarrassment, quick replaced by practicality. If someone wanted to paint me as unstable, I needed people who could speak to who I really was. The first person I thought of was Evelyn Hart. She had been my mentor at Cumberland Mutual since my early years there. A woman in her late 50s with sharp instincts, a warm voice, and a way of seeing people that made them feel known. I called her and explained the situation in as calm a tone as I could manage. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then her voice dropped into a tone I had only heard a few times. A tone that meant she was both angry and protective. She said she would help in any way she could. The next morning, she met me before work and reviewed everything with a precision that reminded me of why she had risen so high in the company. She wrote a detailed statement describing me as steady, disciplined, emotionally grounded, and consistently responsible. She highlighted my work on the fraud audit, noting that my attention to detail and emotional regulation were essential to the role. She signed it with certainty. Then she put her hand on mine and told me I was not alone, no matter how it felt. With each document, each printout, each statement of truth, the folder grew thicker, stronger, a mirror reflecting not who my parents believed I was, but who I had actually become. When the court date arrived for the first full hearing, Knoxville was caught between winter and spring. The sky was pale and washed out. The air is cold enough to sting, but warm enough to smell faintly of thawing earth. I parked near the courthouse and sat in my car for a moment, hands wrapped around the steering wheel, heart beating too loudly. When I exhaled, it fogged the windshield. Iris arrived a few minutes later, walking with the steady confidence of someone who had walked into far worse storms. She greeted me with a small nod. Then we headed inside. The courtroom looked the same as before. Same pale walls, same flickering overhead lights, same polished wood that felt colder than it should. Dad sat on one side with his attorney, Barnett, both dressed in dark suits. Mom sat behind them again, back straight, hands folded over her purse. Seeing them should not have surprised me, but the sight still landed with a weight that made my shoulders tense. Iris placed the folder of documents on our table. She called it the list, a simple name for something so powerful. Inside it were the facts of my life, not assumptions, not opinions, just the truth. When Judge Kellerman entered the courtroom, the air shifted again. That same storm cloud feeling I had sensed before. He asked all parties to be seated and then requested the evidence submissions. Iris stood, walked the folder forward, and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. I watched his hands open the folder. His eyes moved slowly at first, then more sharply. He scanned the breakdown of my assets, my income trail, my mortgage history, the evidence of his refinancing, Evelyn's statement, everything laid out like stepping stones across a river. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The judge turned another page, then another. His brows tightened. His eyes flicked briefly toward Dad. The room grew even quieter, though I could hear the faint buzz of the lights above us and the soft hum of Gru, someone's nervous breathing. Dad shifted in his seat. His jaw twitched. He leaned slightly toward Barnett, as if trying to read over the judge's shoulder. Mom's gaze stayed locked on her lap. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was calm. Too calm. He said that the information provided by my counsel painted a markedly different picture from the one presented by the petitioner. He noted the consistency of my financial record, the stability of my income, the completeness of the documentation. He referenced the refinance records of my parents' home and paused for a long second before continuing. Dad stood abruptly. He said the refinance was irrelevant, that he had explained privately why those decisions were made, that it had nothing to do with his daughter's well-being. He spoke with that same authoritative tone he always used at the dinner table, the tone he expected people to accept without question. Judge Kellerman held up a hand. He told my dad to remain silent unless asked to speak. Dad opened his mouth again, then shut it. The slightest crack appeared in his composure. Iris remained still beside me, her expression unreadable. She looked like someone who had been waiting for this moment. The judge continued reading. He noted Evelyn's statement. He noted the clarity of my financial tracking. He noted the lack of evidence supporting claims of instability. His tone stayed even, but the weight behind it grew heavier with each sentence. David leaned forward again. He said the statements were biased, that I had been hiding things, that I was prone to emotional swings. His voice shook just enough to betray his frustration. Barnett put a hand out, trying to signal him to stop. Judge Kellerman fixed his eyes on him and repeated the instruction to remain silent, this time with more force. Something in the room shifted then. A small fracture. Not loud, not explosive, just a tiny crack in the facade of control my dad had polished for decades. His shoulders tightened. His fingers curled against the table. His jaw clenched hard enough that a muscle jumped beneath his skin. The judge turned another page and rested his hand on the folder. He said that the evidence strongly contradicted the basis of the petition, and that the court needed time to review the full context before making any ruling. He said he would allow both parties to provide additional materials as needed. Dad made a soft sound under his breath, something between a scoff and a growl. He muttered that this was unnecessary, that the facts were clear, that I was incapable of managing alone. His voice rose a fraction before he caught himself. The judge looked up sharply. He warned him again to speak only when given permission. At that moment, I saw something I had never seen before, a crack in my dad's authority, a weakness he could not hide. It was not a breakdown, not yet, but it was enough to show that the ground beneath him was finally shifting too. He glanced back at Mom, and for a moment I thought she might reach for his hand. She did not. She stared straight ahead, face pale, shoulders rigid. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Just a strange, quiet ache. The ache of watching a version of my family crumble in front of me. When the judge closed the folder, the sound echoed through the room, a clean, heavy sound that carried the weight of truth. He said the hearing would continue at the next scheduled date, and just like that, the first crack in their plan had opened. The truth had begun to surface. It was not an explosion, not yet. The shell of my dad's control had finally started to break, and as Judge Kellerman closed the folder and moved it aside, something in the air shifted. It was subtle at first, like a change in pressure before a storm, but I felt it settle deep in my chest. Iris straightened her notes beside me. Barnett leaned in toward my dad with a whisper that was meant to steady him. Mom did not move at all. She just stared forward as if stillness could keep everything from falling apart. The judge cleared his throat and said he would be opening the floor for brief clarification questions before moving forward. It was a routine statement, something courts do to ensure both sides feel heard. But Dad took it as an invitation. He rose before the judge even finished speaking and began talking over him, voice firm and low at first. He said the documents were misleading, that I had always been irresponsible, that the numbers did not tell the full truth about my emotional fragility. He spoke with growing force, trying to reassert control in the only way he knew how, by filling the room with his voice. Barnett grabbed his sleeve lightly and whispered for him to wait, but Dad shook him off without looking. The judge raised a hand, telling him to pause. Dad did not. He said the refinance records did not matter. He said the statements from my mentor were biased. He said my financial consistency was irrelevant because, in his words, stability can be faked. His tone sharpened with each sentence, the calm veneer slipping one crack at a time. I watched his jaw tighten, his posture stiffen, his hands flex as if gripping an argument he was certain he could win by sheer insistence. Judge Kellerman interrupted again, this time with more weight. He told my dad to sit down. The room stilled for a moment, waiting to see what he would do. God did not sit. He took a step forward instead, pointing vaguely toward the list, as if the papers themselves were an accusation he needed to beat back. He said the entire narrative was twisted, that I was putting myself and my future at risk, that I had always needed guidance, even though I refused to admit it. His voice lifted in volume, not quite a shout, but edging dangerously close. The courtroom froze. Even the air felt suspended. Barnett stood abruptly, trying to put himself between Dad and the judge's bench. His voice was strained but polite, as he urged my dad to return to his seat, reminding him that the court had rules. David brushed past him again, the gesture sharp and impatient, like he was swatting away an annoying fly, rather than ignoring the attorney he was paying. I felt my heartbeat pick up, but my face remained calm. That same quiet steadiness I had learned to carry since childhood.
The steadiness that irritated him more than anything.
David said I was too naive to understand the consequences of my decisions. He said I was being manipulated by people who did not have my best interest at heart. He said he was the only one who could protect me from ruining myself. Each sentence revealed more about him than about me, and each one cut through the idea that this had ever been about concern. The judge finally spoke, voice deep and sharp. He warned my dad that another interruption would lead to removal from the courtroom. He emphasized the word removal in a way that left no room for argument. Dad opened his mouth again, and that was the moment the mask snapped. Not cracked, snapped. He raised his voice fully this time, the sound hard enough to bounce off the courtroom walls. He said that this was ridiculous, that he had a right to speak because he was my father, that no judge sitting behind a bench knew me the way he did. His face flushed red, a slow wave starting at his neck and rising upward. The controlled businessman he had always pretended to be was gone. In his place stood a man pulled forward by anger and entitlement. Mom still did not move. Her hands stayed clasped in her lap, but her knuckles were white. Her expression was empty in a way I had never seen. Not distressed, not disapproving, just vacant, as if she had stepped out of the moment entirely. Barnett tried again, stepping toward my dad with urgency now. He put a hand on his shoulder and quietly insisted he sit down. But Dad shrugged him off with such force that the motion rippled through the row behind him. A few people flinched. Someone gasped softly. Judge Kellerman lifted his chin and called for security. The two words felt like they sliced through the air. A bailiff near the wall moved immediately, another approaching from the back of the room. Their steps echoed on the tile floor as they neared my dad. Dad spun toward them with disbelief, as if the idea of someone restraining him was unthinkable. He said he was not finished speaking. He said he had every right to defend his petition. His voice cracked with a mix of outrage and desperation. He insisted that the judge listen to him. But the judge was no longer looking at him. He was looking at the bailiffs. One asked my dad politely to return to his seat. Dad ignored him. The second bailiff stepped closer, posture firm but calm. He repeated the request. David stared at him, the muscle in his jaw twitching again. And for a split second, I thought he would refuse. That moment dragged. The whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then Dad spoke again, but the words came out harsher than before. He said he would not sit down until the judge understood that I was incapable of managing my own life. His voice cracked on the word incapable. It was not anger alone anymore. It was something rawer, something rooted deeper than this hearing. It was the need to be right, the need to be obeyed. The bailiff stepped in beside him, not touching him yet, just forming a quiet perimeter. Their presence was enough to shift the balance in the room. David looked at them, then at the judge, then at me. His eyes widened slightly, as if he suddenly understood what he had revealed. Not to me, not to the court, but to himself. The courtroom stayed utterly still. Mom finally looked up, not at me, at him. Her expression crumbled for a fraction of a second, just long enough to reveal fear. Not fear of losing me, fear of losing the image she had presented to the world for decades. David inhaled sharply like he was about to launch into another speech, but Barnett stepped in front of him and put both hands up in a gesture of calm, restraint. Dad staggered back half a step, shocked by the physical barrier. His composure slipped again. His face twisted. He muttered something under his breath, something I could not hear, but felt in my spine. A final grasp for control. The judge's voice cut through the tension once more, telling the bailiffs to escort him to the hallway to regain composure before the hearing could continue. There was no room for discussion. The bailiffs guided my dad out gently but firmly. He did not resist, but his shoulders stiffened with every step. Not anger exactly, more like humiliation, dripping through the cracks of his authority. When the door shut behind him, the silence that followed was not relief, it was exposure. The air felt colder. The courtroom felt smaller. Everyone seemed to be seeing the same thing at once. This was not a misunderstanding between a concerned father and a struggling daughter. This was a man who could not tolerate losing control, a man who believed his authority outweighed truth, outweighed law, outweighed me. Mom still had not moved. Her hands stayed folded, but her posture had changed. The rigidity was gone. Her shoulders had slumped slightly, like something inside her had been knocked loose. For years, she had played the part of the worried mother, smoothing edges, shaping appearances. Now she sat staring at the courtroom door, the one my dad had just been led through, and she looked small in a way I had never seen. Small without the structure of his certainty beside her. Small without the script she always relied on. When Dad was gone, the judge turned back to us, his voice steady. He said the hearing would pause temporarily and resume only when order was restored. His eyes met mine briefly, and there was no pity in them, only recognition. Recognition of what had just happened. Recognition of what had been exposed. Iris rested a hand lightly on the table beside my arm, her presence grounding. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say yet. This was the kind of moment that spoke for itself, because there are points in life you cannot return from, moments that open a line you cannot uncross. And as the courtroom sat suspended in that stunned silence, I knew we had just reached one of those points, the kind that does not fade with time or smooth itself over with apologies, the kind that draws a permanent line through everything that came before it. When the hearing resumed 30 minutes later, my dad was calmer. Or at least he was trying to appear calm. His face was drained of color, his jaw stiff from holding back whatever storm still moved beneath the surface. Mom remained quiet, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the judge's bench, as if looking directly at anything might make the moment real. But the shift had already happened. Everyone in that room had felt it. Judge Kellerman resumed the session by stating plainly that my dad's behavior would be noted in the record. His tone made clear that it would not be a small note. Then he moved on to his ruling. He said the petition for conservatorship lacked sufficient grounds. He said the evidence presented by my attorney showed no signs of instability, negligence, or financial mismanagement. He said the emergency nature of the filing was unjustified. In the end, he delivered the words I had not allowed myself to hope for, but had desperately needed to hear. The petition is denied. There was no applause. No dramatic gasp, just a heavy shift of energy in the room, like a door closing with finality. My dad stared forward without blinking, his hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned the color of bone. Mom exhaled quietly, not relief, not sadness, more like resignation. The judge did not stop there. He said that due to the inconsistencies and exaggerated claims in the petition, the court was recommending a review of whether the filing constituted bad faith. His words were measured, but the implication landed with the weight of a hammer. Filing in bad faith meant attempting to misuse the court system for personal gain. It meant potential fine. In severe cases, it could mean legal consequences. I glanced at Iris. She gave a slight, controlled nod. She had seen this possibility long before I had. Dad's attorney, Barnett, rose quickly and objected, saying the filing was made out of genuine concern. But the judge cut him off. The record contradicts that, he said, and the court takes misuse of emergency petitions very seriously. His tone left no room for rebuttal. When the hearing adjourned, my dad stood abruptly again, but said nothing. Not a word. He walked out of the courtroom stiffly, Barnett hurrying behind him. Mom followed more slowly, her shoulders curved inward, as if she were shrinking under the weight of something she could no longer deny. I watched them go. There was no satisfaction in it. Not yet, just a cold awareness that something irreversible had happened. In the days that followed, everything unfolded with a quiet but undeniable force. The court initiated a preliminary review into whether my dad had knowingly filed a petition without valid cause. I was told I would not need to be involved until later stages, unless. The review escalated. Iris explained that these processes often moved slowly, but carried serious consequences. News of the denied petition spread more quickly than I expected. In communities like the one my parents lived in, where church circles and neighborhood groups formed the backbone of social reputation, Information traveled like wildfire through dry brush. People whispered in grocery store aisles. They murmured after Sunday service. They talked in low voices in the parking lots of school events. Not everyone knew the full story, but they knew enough. They knew the petition had failed. They knew the court was looking into my dad's actions. They knew something had cracked the image of the steady, respectable man he had always presented to the world. Dad tried to hold his head up in public. He showed up to church with Mom as if nothing had happened. He attended community meetings. He volunteered for things he normally avoided, but whispers followed him quietly, weaving through conversations. People avoid eye contact when they sense something is wrong, but are too polite to say it. The tension only deepened as the legal review continued. Mom suffered her own kind of fallout. She had always been deeply involved in the women's ministry, the charity drives, the neighborhood committees. She had been the one who baked pies for church events and organized meal deliveries for sick members. Her identity was wrapped tightly around being seen as dependable, gracious, involved. But after the hearing, the invitations slowed. The calls dimmed. The friendliness cooled in subtle ways that only someone who had lived in that environment for decades would notice. People smiled politely but offered no warmth. They hesitated before speaking to her, unsure of whether her support of Dad's petition made her complicit or simply blind. She tried to keep serving in her circles, but the shift was unmistakable. Her place in those groups had always depended on maintaining the image of a stable, admirable family. And now that image has cracked. No one said it out loud, but the message hung in the space between every interaction. If she had been part of an attempt to strip her own daughter of independence, how much of her behavior could be trusted? While their reputations dimmed, my own life in Knoxville stayed strangely calm, quiet even. I went to work. I finished the audit review. I ate dinner alone at my kitchen table and tried to let myself breathe again. But something inside me stayed taut for weeks, as if waiting for the next blow. I did not call my parents. They did not call me. The silence between us felt like a canyon, wide and echoing. At night, I sometimes wondered if they regretted anything, whether the severity of the consequences had made them reconsider their choices, or whether they believed even more firmly that they had been right, that I had forced their hand by refusing their guidance. But the truth was becoming clearer with each passing day. This was not about regret. This was about exposure. Years of control, masked as protection, had finally been dragged into light. And light has a way of burning things that cannot withstand honesty. About 5 weeks after the hearing, I received a call from Iris. She told me the court review had advanced. The findings indicated that the petition not only lacked merit, but showed signs of intentional misrepresentation. That phrase stuck with me, cold and sharp. Intentional misrepresentation. Not mistaken, not misled. Intentional. She told me my dad might face financial penalties. In extreme cases, the state could consider further action. But even beyond the legal implications, the review itself would remain part of the public record, a permanent notation that he had attempted to misuse the legal system to gain control of another adult's property. I thanked her quietly, though the gratitude did not reach all the way through me. I hung up the phone and sat on my couch, hands clasped around a mug I no longer remembered pouring. My living room was warm from the late afternoon sun, but I felt a coolness settle across my skin. Karma is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives in the form of natural consequences. Sometimes it is not poetic or theatrical. Sometimes it is simply truth catching up to those who tried to outrun it. For my dad, karma came as a paper trail he could not deny, a legal note he could not scrub away, a reputation tarnished not by rumor, but by documented fact. For my mom, it came as a quiet distancing from the community she had relied on to define herself. No shouting, no confrontation, just a gentle but undeniable closing of doors. I did not celebrate. I did not feel vindicated. I felt the weight of what it meant to be free of their grasp, and I felt the cost of that freedom. Because when family fractures like that, there is no joy in the breaking, only clarity. Late one afternoon, weeks after the court decision, I received a short email from my dad. No greeting, no apology, no explanation, just a single sentence saying he hoped I understood that everything he did was out of love. I stared at it for a long time. Love does not file petitions to take your life from you. Love does not twist itself into chains and call it protection. I closed my laptop without replying. Outside, the early spring breeze carried a hint of warmth. The world was shifting again. Not violently this time, but in small, familiar ways. Leaves budding, days lengthening, the air is softening, and as I stood there at my window, watching the light fade across my quiet street, I realized that even when karma moves silently, its echoes stay with you, because some things, once revealed, cannot be unseen. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be unbroken. That truth settled over the weeks that followed, quiet but heavy, wrapping itself around everything that still connected me to my parents. I moved through my days with a strange steadiness, almost like someone walking across a bridge that had already collapsed behind them. There was no going back, even if part of me wished I could salvage something small, something human, from what remained. But life has a way of revealing what people really are when the masks fall. And the next revelation came from the person I least expected. Cole. My younger brother had stayed silent through the entire process. He lived in Indianapolis, about an hour from our parents. We had always been close, in our own quiet way. Not emotionally intertwined, but steady. A comfortable sibling bond built on shared childhood and an unspoken understanding that we survived our parents by leaning sideways, never directly into their expectations. When everything with the court happened, I assumed he stayed out of it because he did not know what to think, or because he was caught between loyalty to them and affection for me, or because avoidance had always been his way of coping. I was wrong. He reached out one Saturday morning in late April. The call came just after sunrise. His name lit up my phone, and my heart thumped once, sharp and uncertain. I answered with a cautious hello, bracing myself for whatever version of him I might get. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries a weight. Then he asked if he could come down to Knoxville for a few days, just to talk. I told him, yes, of course. I did not realize then how important that moment would become. He arrived that same afternoon. He looked older than I remembered, though he was only in his early 30s. His shoulders hunched, his eyes tired, his hands fidgeting in that familiar way he had when he was thinking too hard. We sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I had opened the petition months earlier. Cole stared at the wood grain for a long time before speaking. He said he had finally talked to Dad. Really talked to him. Not a brief call, not a surface-level check-in. A real conversation. Dad had wanted him to support the idea that I was unstable. He had asked him to write a letter to the court describing times when I had struggled or made questionable choices. He had suggested that Cole, as my brother, could help prove his case. I felt my stomach twist when Cole paused, looking down at his hands. Then he told me gently that Dad had not asked him. Dad had pressured him. Dad had cornered him with guilt and obligation. Dad had insisted that families should support each other and hinted that Cole owed him for years of upbringing. Cole said he refused. He said he told Dad that nothing about my life suggested instability. He told him that I was the most disciplined person in our family. He told him that the only instability he saw came from the petition itself and the desperation behind it. He said Dad did not take it well. David raised his voice, accused him of betrayal, accused him of choosing sides, accused him of being manipulated by me. The argument escalated until Mom stepped in, but even she could not settle it. Cole said her face looked hollow, like someone had drained the last ounce of certainty from her. When he finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair, eyes glassy, but not with tears. With clarity. He said this was the first time he had realized that Dad's control was not just a quirk or a flaw. It was a force, a grip, a belief that he was entitled to our lives and choices. Hearing Cole say it out loud did something to me. Not relief, not vindication, just a deeper settling of the truth I was finally learning to accept. Some families break in a single moment. Others break in slow shifts, until the final crack rings loud enough for everyone to hear. Ours had cracked over years, but the final break came the day Cole told Dad no. That was the moment our family truly fractured. We talked for hours about childhood, about expectations, about the pressure that had shaped us both in ways we had learned to normalize. He told me he felt guilty for not standing up sooner. I told him none of this was his fault. I meant it. At one point, Cole asked if I thought things would ever return to normal. I did not have to think long. I told him there was no normal to return to. What we had before was not wholeness. It was a performance held together by fear, obligation, and silence. He nodded slowly, letting the truth settle around us like quiet dust. Later that evening, he asked if Mom had reached out to me. I told him no. He looked away then, his expression tightening. He said she had been struggling socially. People at church avoided talking to her about the hearing. Her closest friends kept their distance. Even the small committee she had served on for years was now gently pushing her out. He said she felt humiliated, not because of the harm done to me, not because of the petition, but because people were talking, because the version of family she had projected for decades had been shattered. Her distress was not grief for what she had done. It was grief for how she was now seen. That was a realization I wished had hurt less, but truth rarely arrives gently. Cole stayed for 2 nights. We cooked simple meals, walked the greenway near my home, talked in slow, steady conversations that felt like relearning each other. On his last morning with me, he stood in my entryway, holding his bag, and said he was proud of me. Those words landed softly, but deeply. I hugged him before he left, a full, tight hug that lingered just a second longer than it used to when we were kids saying goodbye after holidays. When the door closed behind him, my house felt quieter, but not lonely, more like a place where truth could breathe again. In the days after his visit, I thought often about the breaking of our family, not with anger, not with grief, with a kind of recognition, like watching a house you grew up in being torn down and finally seeing the unstable foundation beneath it. Dad had lost his image. Mom had lost her audience. The mask was gone, and with it the illusion that we had ever been a unified whole. What remained was a handful of people standing in separate rooms, staring at the pieces of something that had only looked solid from a distance. I did not reach out to them. They did not reach out to me. Even through the silence, I could feel a kind of shifting, a recognition in all of us that nothing could return to what it had been. Not everything broken can be repaired, and not everything broken should be. One quiet evening in early May, I sat on my porch as the sun dipped low across my street, breathing in the soft, warm air. I watched a family 2 houses down laughing as they played with their dog on the lawn. Their joy felt light, easy, grounded. I realized then that I was not jealous. I was simply aware of the difference. Some families build themselves on connection. Ours had built itself on image, fear, and control. And once I finally saw that fully, there was no unseeing it. The breaking was not a tragedy. The pretending had been a tragedy. And once that truth settled inside me, the final pieces of my old life slipped quietly into place. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with any kind of triumphant rush, more like a soft closing of a door I had once been afraid to touch, a door that led back to a family I could no longer return to, no matter how much of me still wished things had been different. In the weeks that followed, the silence between us stretched into something wide and permanent. I kept expecting a message from my parents, even something short or vague, but nothing came. No apology. No attempt at repair. No acknowledgement of the choices that had brought us here. It surprised me at first, how final their silence felt, how it held no curiosity about the daughter they almost lost in a courtroom, no remorse about the petition itself, no recognition of the harm. When I finally stopped expecting the phone to ring, I realized something important. A family can break with noise, but the real ending often arrives quietly, in what is no longer said. In the absence of what used to be demanded, in the space where control once lived and now only emptiness remains. I mourned them in my own way. Not like grieving a death, more like grieving the version of them I had spent my life believing in. The father I had once imagined, the mom I had hoped would one day choose honesty over image. Those versions were gone. But if I was honest with myself, they had never really existed. They had been shadows I held close, because the real shape of our family was too hard to face. Letting go of those shadows felt like stepping into cold water. It shocked me at first, but then it steadied my breathing. Around that same time, work grew calmer. The fraud investigation closed successfully, and Evelyn pulled me aside one afternoon, giving my shoulder a firm, warm squeeze. She said she was proud of how I had handled everything, both at work and outside it. She said most people crumble under that kind of pressure. I did not feel strong at that moment, but hearing her say it helped me believe that strength can sometimes look like surviving what should have broken you. One evening in early June, I took a long walk along the greenway. Fireflies were beginning to show up in small, glowing specks along the grassy edges. The sun had just dipped low, leaving behind one of those soft Tennessee skies brushed with pink and gold. As I walked, I thought about everything I had lost. Not just my relationship with my parents, not just the illusion of who they were, but also the comfort of believing that family always means safety, that parents always mean love, that blood always means loyalty. Losing those beliefs stung in a way nothing else had, because they were the foundation I had built my early life on. Without them, I had to rebuild something new, something truer, something that belonged entirely to me. But there was clarity, too. Real clarity, the kind you only earn after walking through fire without anyone to carry you. I realized I had kept something far more valuable than the relationship they tried to take from me. I had kept my boundaries, my independence, my stability, my voice, my home, my sense of self. All the pieces of my life I had built, slowly, carefully, over years of steady work and small sacrifices. They had tried to wrap control in the language of protection, but when the mask fell, the truth stood there plain. Parents can raise you, parents can love you, but being a parent does not entitle anyone to ownership of your life. Not your money, not your autonomy, not your choices, not your adulthood. Love without respect becomes possession, and possession is not love at all. I spent the next few months building new routines. On Sundays, I drank coffee on my porch instead of calling home. On holidays, I made plans with friends. On my birthday that summer, I took myself to a small Italian place near downtown. I sat alone, with a glass of wine and a plate of pasta, and for the first time in my adult life, I did not feel lonely. I felt peaceful. Because peace is not the absence of people, it is the absence of control. Cole and I talked more often. Some weeks he drove down for a visit. Other weeks we met halfway in a small Kentucky town for dinner. We never talked long about our parents, not because the topic was forbidden, but because we both understood there was nothing left to fix. He said once that he missed who he thought they were, not who they actually were. I understood that feeling deeply. One warm evening in mid-July, I sat in my backyard watching the light fade through the trees. My townhouse felt solid around me, quiet and safe. I thought about the courtroom, the petition, the cracks in my parents' voices, the security officers stepping forward, the moment everything split open. I thought about the cost of finally being seen for who I really was, not a child, not a possession, not someone who needed to be guided or controlled. Just a woman standing in her own life. And I realized then that the biggest loss was not the family I no longer had. It was the years I spent believing I owed them more of myself than I truly did. My dad lost his image. My mom lost her stage. But I did not lose myself. I kept the one thing they never expected me to fight for: my freedom to live on my own terms. I sat there until the last bit of sunlight slipped behind the trees, feeling the quiet settle around me in a way that felt earned, not given. Earned through truth and pain and clarity, and maybe through a kind of revenge, too. Not the loud, vengeful kind. Not the dramatic stories people tell with fire in their voice. My revenge was quieter. It was choosing myself, walking away, refusing to let their version of me become my reality. Sometimes the strongest revenge is simply living a life no one can take from you. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.